Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 609. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. Got a lot of news to get through on today's show. Also want to let my audience know that I was on Judge Napolitano's show yesterday afternoon. So if you didn't catch that yet, head on over to the Judging Freedom channel and listen to my appearance there. I will also be on the Scott Horton show this week, so look for that at the Libertarian Institute sometime Friday or over the weekend. If you want more of this show, of course, you could subscribe to it at YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee, or anywhere you listen to those audio podcasts. It's also hosted at the Libertarian Institute, where I am the news editor and write news articles, and we repost the show on the blog at antiwar.com, where I'm the opinion editor and put together the viewpoint section for y'all every day. All right, let's get into the news that we have today. And the first story is one I wrote for the Institute on June 5th. Zelensky fears Trump will make peace deal with Russia. So, not sure if Zelensky really needs to be all that concerned about this, but he gave some interesting comments to The Guardian that I wanted to talk about here. So, Ukrainian President Zelensky said he believes former President Donald Trump, if he is elected in November, then he will make a peace deal with Russia. Trump has previously claimed he will end the war if re-elected, but has not detailed how he will achieve that. In an interview with The Guardian, Zelensky said if Trump is re-elected, he will end U.S. support, weapons, and money shipments to Ukraine. He believes a re-elected Trump will make a deal with Russian President Vladimir Putin to end the war. On the campaign trail, Trump asserted he could end the war within 24 hours of becoming president. He also pledged to make deals and improve the relationship with Russia during his 2016 campaign. However, during his term as president, Trump failed to follow through on these promises and actually significantly escalated tensions with Russia, and in very meaningful ways. This really gets lost in American political discourse, but things extremely important to Russia were things such as the INF Treaty, the Open Skies Treaty, the U.S. taking the step for the first time under Trump to provide weapons to Ukraine, conducting war games in Ukraine, treating Ukraine as a NATO ally. These are all things that began under Trump. Yes, they escalated under Biden. That's ultimately when the war broke out. But this fantasy that Trump is some kind of Putin puppet, or there's a Putin faction of the Republican Party, right? The American officials most likely to drape themselves in American flag and to wrap their entire personality around Americana are the ones that are also frequently say, oh, these are the pro-Putin puppets. No, these are the America First people. But anyways, the idea that these are Putin puppets is completely ridiculous. But back on to Donald Trump, looking at his track record as president, not only was he not a Putin puppet, he was a Russian hawk during his time in office. So Zelensky claimed Trump would become a, quote, loser president for ending the war, and it would make America very weak. While details on Trump's proposal remain vague, the former president has called for Ukraine to cede territory controlled by Russia to Moscow. Zelensky and President Biden maintain that Ukraine must be allowed to recapture all its territory. However, Kiev's prospects for restoring Ukraine's post-Cold War borders appear dim. Moscow has annexed 5 regions of Ukraine and says the land will not be returned. Additionally, Ukraine's offensive attempt to regain some of its territory last summer failed. Currently, Russian forces are on the move and capturing more territory in eastern Ukraine. Before the war and during its early months, Kiev and its Western backers could have inked a deal with Moscow that would have preserved nearly all of Ukraine's territory in exchange for neutrality, a pledge Ukraine would not join NATO. And so this was really important. And Ted Snyder is probably one of our writers at antiwar.com. He's also published at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft and the American Conservative, but he has wrote countless articles and really has every single detail on this down, and all the different sources and everything, that Russia really was willing in the early days of the war say that Ukraine can sign pacts with the US, UK, Germany, France, whoever they want to agree that, they would be a security guarantor for Ukraine if Ukraine would agree not to join NATO, agree to some demilitarization, some what they call denazification, which I think probably meant stripping the Azov battalion out of the Ukrainian National Guard, and then Russia would allow not only Zaporizhia and Kherson, which are the two regions of Ukraine that they captured during the early months, but also the Donbass in its republics, Donetsk and Luhansk, to both remain a part of Ukraine. Now, they would have significant autonomy, but this isn't even unknown to Europe. Apparently, the autonomy would represent the autonomy given to a northern region of Italy. And so, this would have been very commonplace. And in fact, that region of Italy is incredibly wealthy, one of the wealthiest in all of Europe. And so the deal here was setting up something that could potentially work, something that could potentially benefit the people who live in what is now a war zone. And instead, Zelensky was urged by Washington and London to forgo diplomacy and to attempt to vanquish Russian forces from Ukrainian land. Passing on the deal has come at high cost for Ukraine. Kiev has lost hundreds of thousands of men in the war. Additionally, Russia has seized control over most of eastern and southern Ukraine and says that the territory will not be returned to Kiev's control. Additionally, Russia said because of the weapons that the U.S. has sent Ukraine, it's going to continue to take territory to protect Russian territory. And so that's what we're seeing going on in the Kharkiv region. So very, very interesting there that Zelensky would be so worried about Trump when I don't think it's likely he would just immediately pull the ripcord on this war, go and, do what he said in 24 hours end this war. But given his track record, I think it's very possible that he ends up basically just on the Biden path here, that they're going to Trump-proof is what they call it, the future aid for this war, and Trump isn't going to be able to stop sending those weapons to Ukraine. He's just going to keep it going. But any amount of questioning if this war is worth it to keep fighting, as Trump will do, is something that I think Ukraine can't have, because if diplomacy is on the table, Ukraine's losing, so diplomacy is obviously preferable for everybody who isn't sitting in Kiev and Washington and London right now, because Zelensky, this war is his control on power. If there's an election in the country, I highly doubt he would win after choosing to fight a war and getting a worse deal in the end of it. Would likely see him removed by the Ukrainian people from leadership. Of course, if Biden dumps over $100 billion into this war, and again, it ends up as a loser for the Ukrainians, well, that's going to hurt his re-election prospects in November. And I believe the UK now has an election coming up this summer as well. All right. This one from Dave DeCamp, June 5th, antiwar.com. U.S. warns dual citizens will be stuck in Ukraine under new mobilization law. So on Tuesday, the U.S. Embassy in Ukraine issued a warning to U.S. Ukrainian dual citizens that they may no longer be able to leave Ukraine under the country's new mobilization law. Under martial law that was imposed in February of 2022, Ukrainian males aged 18 to 60 cannot leave the country. Before the new mobilization law took effect, there were exceptions in place for dual U.S. Ukrainian nationals, but now they can be forced to stay. So the U.S. Embassy said, the U.S. Embassy in Kiev understands that effective June 1, Ukraine has eliminated a residence abroad exception that previously allowed certain Ukrainian males aged 18 to 60 to depart the country. After this change, U.S. Ukrainian dual citizens, including those living in the U.S., may no longer be allowed to depart the country. The embassy added, it was limited in our ability to influence Ukrainian law, including the application of martial law and the mobilization law to Ukrainian citizens, and advised any dual U.S. Ukrainian nationals that are in the country to shelter in place and obey all local orders. The embassy continued, if you are not currently in Ukraine, we strongly recommend against all travel to Ukraine by U.S. male citizens aged 18 to 60 who also have Ukrainian citizenship or also claim Ukrainian citizenship and do not wish to stay in Ukraine indefinitely. There is an extremely high risk you will not be allowed to depart, even with a U.S. passport. Ukraine is facing a significant manpower shortage and is taking extreme measures to fill its ranks, including pressuring Ukrainian men living abroad to combat by cutting their consular services. Ukraine's parliament also recently passed a bill that allows prisoners, including murderers, to volunteer to join the military. And maybe even worse, they're sending untrained men to the front lines. And so that's a really horrific thing to do. All right, this is a follow-up on a story that we talked about first on Wednesday's show. That is that Ukraine was using the U.S. provided HIMARS rocket systems to go ahead and hit Russian targets inside of Ukraine. And we initially had these reports from Ukrainian, but now we have a Republican senator confirming this. So Senator Mike Rounds, a Republican from South Dakota and a member of the Senate Armed Services Committee, confirmed to the Associated Press on Wednesday that Ukraine has used U.S.-provided weapons to carry out strikes on Russian territory, which risks a major response from Russia. The report also cited unnamed Western officials who said Ukraine used U.S. weapons on Russian territory. The report did not specify what type of weapon systems was used, but it came after a Ukrainian lawmaker claimed U.S. provided HIMARS rocket systems destroyed a Russian S-300 and S-400 air defense missile systems inside Russia's Belgorod Oblast. Really hope that's not true. One thing I'd like to bring up here is apparently the HIMARS have been relatively neutralized by Russia, so it would seem to be a pretty massive miscalculation on Moscow's part if they didn't have the necessary electronic warfare systems in place in Belgorod, because Blinken has been signaling for weeks that the U.S. was preparing to do this, and so you would assume that Russia would have had systems in place to neutralize the HIMARS. Now, it's also possible that, maybe the U.S. and Ukraine shift things up a little bit with the HIMARS, and this caused, the Russians to miscalculate or miss one of them or something like that. But this is a pretty serious and concerning escalation. All right, next up here, we just have one story on China that I want to discuss. This from Dave DeCamp, antiwar.com, June 4th. U.S. Marines deploy MQ-9 Reaper drones to the Philippines. So the U.S. Marine Corps MQ-9 Reaper drones are now operating in the Philippines as the U.S. continues to beef up its military presence in the country. The Reaper drones, which can be armed with powerful Hellfire missiles, have been operating out of the Philippines since the spring at the request of Manila as the two nations are increasing intelligence sharing. A spokesperson for the 1 Marine Expeditionary Force told USNI that the Marine Corps will employ the unarmed MQ-9 A's to provide reconnaissance and surveillance in support of the development of intelligence sharing between the U.S. and our Philippine allies. U.S. Reaper drones have been deployed to support the Philippines in the South China Sea, where tensions are soaring between Manila and Beijing over disputed routes and rates in the waters. The U.S. is strongly backing the Philippines in the dispute and has even committed itself to intervene if the situation turns into a shooting war. Whenever there is an incident between the Chinese and Philippines boats in the South China Sea, the U.S. takes the opportunity to remind China that the U.S.-Philippine Mutual Defense Treaty applies to attacks on Philippines boats in disputed waters. According to UNSI, U.S. Reaper drones conducted 5 sorties over the South China Sea in March to support critical maritime domain awareness and overwatch of the Second Thomas Shoal, referring to a disputed reef that's been a major source of tensions between Manila and Beijing. The Philippines has a World War II era ship that's grounded on the Second Thomas Shoal and uses it as a base of operations in the area. China often intercepts Philippines boats trying to resupply the ship, and sometimes it encounters and end in collisions or with Chinese vessels firing water cannons. And so If anybody's watching the show here, you can actually see a map, not only of where the Scarborough Shoal is, which is, I think, near the location of that second Thomas Shoal, but also just all the competing claims between all these Southeast Asian nations: Vietnam, Malaysia, the Philippines, Taiwan, China, and the U.S. basically will back anybody's claim as long as it is against China, even though a lot of these countries have their own overlapping claims, such as Vietnam and the Philippines. All right, time to move on and talk some news about what's happening in Israel. First, we're going to cover what happened at the Flag Day March in Jerusalem. So, the Flag Day March is just an Israeli celebration day where they march through the streets of the Arab portion of Jerusalem and chant death to Arabs and things like that. It's a really kind of a nasty type of celebration. And so Dave DeCamp writes here, on Wednesday, the Israeli finance minister Bezalel Smotrich and the minister of national security Itamar Ben-Gvir both called for Israel to escalate in Gaza and to invade southern Lebanon. The two ministers made their remarks in speeches during the provocative Flag Day March in the Old City of Jerusalem that commemorates Jerusalem Day, a celebration of Israel's capture of East Jerusalem during the 1967 war. Thousands of ultranationalist Israelis took part in the march, which involved chants of, quote, death to Arabs and attacks on Palestinians. More on that later. During his speech, Ben-Gvir led the crowd in a chant of victory and said Israel could only win once it enters all of Gaza and fights until victory. He also said that Israel needs to go into the north and fight Hezbollah and destroy them. Smotrich called on Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu to give the order to go to war with Hezbollah. He said, let our historic warriors win, restore our national honor, national pride, and security, and allow the heroic residents to return home safely. Netanyahu on Wednesday signaled he's considering an invasion of Lebanon, saying that Israel was prepared for very intense operations along the northern border. Ben-Gvir also declared on Wednesday that his policy was that Jews could pray at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, also known as the Temple Mount to the Israelis, whenever they want, going against the status quo at the compound. According to Haaretz, it marks the first time that an Israeli minister in charge of security at Al-Aqsa divided from the status quo. In a radio interview, Ben-Gvir said he was pleased that Jews went to the Temple Mount and prayed there today. This is very important. My policy is very clear on this matter. Jews can go everywhere in Jerusalem and pray anywhere and not silently. Jews prayed on the Temple Mount. That's the minister's policy. Jews prayed on the Temple Mount, and that is good. Later in the day, Ben-Gvir reiterated his position. I want to come back and send a message to Hamas and every house in Gaza and the north. Jerusalem is ours. The Damascus Gate is ours. The Temple Mount is ours. Today, per my policy, Jews freely entered the old city and Jews prayed on the Temple Mount. We can simply claim it's ours. He said, according to Haaretz. Netanyahu pushed back on Ben-Gvir's comments, saying that the status quo regarding the Temple Mount has not and will not change. I think this is likely to significantly inflame tensions in Israel between the Israelis and the Palestinians. We will see what comes of this. Just another little part of the Flag Day March. This is from a Middle East Eye report. Far-right Israelis attacked journalists and Palestinian shop owners on Wednesday as hundreds marched through the occupied East Jerusalem to celebrate Israel's domination of the city. The annual Flag Day March, which is part of Jerusalem Day holiday, commemorates the occupation of the city by Israel in 1967. It passes through the Muslim majority neighborhoods in East Jerusalem's Old City. On Wednesday afternoon, a large number of Israeli settlers began marching in the vicinity of the Damascus Gate, the chief entrance of the Old City for Palestinians in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem. The settlers confronted Palestinian shop owners, demanding they close their shops ahead of the rally. Settlers threw stones and bottles at Palestinians and chanted inflammatory slogans, including "Death to Arabs" and "Muhammad is dead." Haaretz journalist Nir Hassan was knocked to the ground and kicked by Israeli youth before police officers intervened, the newspaper reported. Additionally, another photojournalist was trying to help him, and was attacked as well. So it was a pretty gruesome scene to see members of the press attacked like that by, these young men. Very disturbing footage. Several videographers were also attacked as Israeli youths attempted to violently prevent reporters from filming them. Palestinian photographer Ghassan Ed was among those wounded during the confrontations. All right, next up here, this one from Haaretz is Israel waged secret influence campaign targeting American congressmen. So Haaretz reports the Israeli government is behind a large-scale influence campaign primarily aimed at black lawmakers and young progressives in the United States and Canada. The operation, whose existence was first reported by Haaretz in March, was launched after the start of the war in Gaza and was intended to sway certain segments of the public opinion on Israel's conflict. The influence campaign made extensive use of fake websites and social media to promote content that is pro-Israel, anti-Palestinian, and anti-Muslim, as well as different information about anti-Semitism on American campuses, according to an investigation by Fake Report organization published today. The operation was run by a private Israeli online political campaigning firm called Stoic, STOIC in all caps, that was hired for the project. According to sources and information obtained by Haaretz, the operation was commissioned by Israel's Diaspora Affairs Ministry, but was carried out by a different party for fear that its exposure could entangle the Israelis in a crisis. The ministry oversees a number of firms for a number of different purposes and goals. Among the candidates for the job was the organization Voices of Israel, which received half of the original funding from the Israeli government, though was not tapped for the task in the end. And one thing to point out here, of course, is we constantly have this alarmism and these cries, particularly from liberals in the United States, that, oh, we have all this election interference. Oh, our elections are in jeopardy. Oh, China, Russia interfering in our democracy, malign activity, yeah. And it turns out that it's the country that we give more money to, that most of our congressmen deem our closest allies, that are truly the ones trying to influence and sway American elections. All right, next up here, this is horrible. Israel kills 29 by bombing UN shelter. So this is from the Palestinian Chronicle. The director of the government media office in Gaza said in a press conference that the number of people killed is expected to rise due to the large number of serious and critical injuries. The Israeli army admitted to carrying out the attack, claiming its warplanes bombed a compound used by Hamas inside a school belonging to UNRWA in the Nasrat refugee camp in the central Gaza Strip. Initial media reports, including those by Al Jazeera, said at least 29 Palestinians were killed as a result of the Israeli shelling that targeted the school housing displaced people in Camp 2 in Nusrat. And so this is just absolutely disgusting. Israel is targeting these shelters, and the U.S. is going to claim, oh, they should really, maybe conduct some kind of investigation into this, which won't happen. And then the the U.S. government will move on and never care again about Israel using its weapons to carry out this genocide. All right, next up here, this one from Dave DeCamp, June 5th, antiwar.com. Hamas reiterates call for permanent ceasefire and Israeli withdrawal from Gaza for hostage deal. So the head of Hamas's political bureau reaffirmed on Wednesday that the Palestinian group's conditions of a permanent ceasefire and Israeli withdrawal from Gaza for any hostage deal with Israel. He said the movement and factions of the resistance will deal seriously and positively with any agreement that is based on a comprehensive ending of the aggression and the complete withdrawal and prisoner swap. The ceasefire proposal presented by President Biden to the public involves a 6-week truce and an initial hostage and prisoner exchange in the first phase. During that time, the two sides are supposed to negotiate a permanent ceasefire, and the Israeli withdrawal will begin in the second phase. Israeli officials say the language is vague enough that Israel could agree to the deal without actually committing to a permanent ceasefire, but the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu continues to express his opposition to ending military operations in Gaza, which could sabotage the deal, as it is making Hamas more likely to ask for stronger guarantees. Biden presented the potential ceasefire as an Israeli proposal, but Netanyahu said there were, quote, gaps in what Israel had agreed to and what Biden outlined. The U.S. is still pushing for the deal, and the director of the CIA, William Burns, is expected to meet with Egyptian and Qatari officials about this week. Meanwhile, Israel continues to slaughter Palestinians across Gaza and has escalated operations in the central part of the Gaza Strip. Al Jazeera reported on Wednesday that 75 Palestinians were killed in central Gaza over the past 24 hours. The Israeli Defense Minister, Yoav Gallant, reiterated on Wednesday that Israel would not halt its military operations to foster negotiations. Any negotiations with Hamas would be conducted only under fire. And so, I think in reality, what we're seeing here is that the U.S. and Israel are really seeking a deal here where Hamas gives up everything at the start and just hopes that Israel has to follow through with everything, and which of course really isn't a workable deal. And the U.S. policy is, well, because Hamas won't accept this unworkable deal, then everyone who dies in Gaza is dying because of Hamas's actions, or else they would be alive. So this one from Middle East Eye: U.S. policy on Gaza ceasefire is collective punishment for Palestinians. The Middle East Eye writes, in several exchanges with reporters this week, U.S. State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller called on Hamas to end the suffering and deaths of innocent Palestinians in Gaza by accepting a ceasefire, in remarks that have been criticized as leveraging collective punishment against the Palestinian people. On Tuesday, Miller was asked during a press briefing about the terms of the latest ceasefire proposal and why Hamas would accept an agreement that would see the dissolution of the group itself. The spokesperson responded, because they don't want to see the continued conflict, continued Palestinian people dying. They don't want to see war in Gaza. The comments by Miller were criticized by legal experts who say that Washington was admitting to using the collective punishment of Palestinian civilians as a bargaining chip against Hamas leadership. Then on Wednesday, the issue was again brought up in the State Department press briefing. So Tom Bateman, a correspondent with the BBC, asked, you say that Hamas and Sinwar, the leadership of Hamas, should bear in mind that what should draw them to a ceasefire is that the Palestinian people are being killed. But your position is that no Palestinian civilians should be killed. So why do you need to raise the point to pressure Hamas? He asked. And in response, Miller said, it's just a point of actual fact. And so Bateman said, it feels rather contradictory if your position is that the Palestinian civilians should not be killed to raise a specific point of pressure on Hamas to come to a ceasefire. And so, this is an essential admission that Israel is killing civilians in Gaza to try to force Hamas to agree to what, all their demands are, this unreasonable, unworkable deal. And, then the U.S. is just going to blame Hamas for everything and put no blame on Israel, even though they're the ones actually killing the civilians. All right, next up here, this one from Jason Ditz, June 5th, antiwar.com. Netanyahu says, is Israel pressured for very intense war? Israel prepared for a very intense war with Lebanon. So yesterday, it was reported that Britain had informed the Lebanese government that it should prepare for a full-scale war with Israel by mid-month. This report now appears to be confirmed as Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu tots up Israel's readiness for such a war. Following a cabinet meeting, Netanyahu declared on Wednesday that Israel is prepared for a very intense operation against Lebanon, asserting that he would restore calm to the north of Israel one way or another. For 8 months, Israel and Hezbollah have been trading near daily fire across the border, and Israeli politicians have demanded a resolution as tens of thousands of Israeli civilians are displaced by the military action. War has been anticipated all year, but this starting point has moved closer, with the Israeli army chief reiterating that Israel is ready for an offensive and that a decision point is in hand. The Lebanese prime minister claims reports of an imminent war are baseless and that repeated media reports of British warning are untrue. He added that he's never been given any warning. And I wonder if the British warning is, a real warning that war is coming. I think that's very possible. I think the other possibility is maybe the UK is working with Israel to try to bully Lebanon into complying with the Israeli demands, and that is for Hezbollah to move several miles away from the border, all the way on the northern side of the Litani River in Lebanon. All right, next up here, this one, Dave DeCamp, June 5th, antiwar.com. IRGC vows revenge for Israeli killing of Iranian military advisor in Syria. So the commander of the Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, vowed on Wednesday that Israel will pay for killing an Iranian military advisor in Syria in strikes that hit targets north of Aleppo on Monday night. Iranian media reported that IRGC advisor Saeed Abir was killed in the streets, marking the first Iranian killed by Israel since April 1st, when Israel bombed the Iranian consulate in Damascus. So the IRG chief, Major General Hossein Salmani, said the child-killing Zionist criminals should know that they will pay for the innocent blood that was shed in this crime. They should wait for a response. And it'll be interesting to see what happened. It seemed that, the Iranian response to what Israel did on April 1st by launching those drones and missiles was meant to be a significant sign of the Iranian power in the region. And this is Israel, I think, really to show it doesn't have to listen. So it will be interesting to see here what the Iranian response may be and when it may come. It may take some time before we see what the response is. All right, last up here today, this one, Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com, and Dave wrote up a new report by the MITS Migration Center on what's happening on the Saudi-Yemeni border, where there are a lot of people from the Horn of Africa trying to flow through Yemen and into Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia has engaged in some pretty brutal practices to try to keep those people out. So on Wednesday, the MITS Migration Center, MMC, published a report that said Saudi Arabia is still slaughtering African migrants and Yemenis at a border with Yemen nearly a year after the indiscriminate killings were revealed. In July of 2023, MMC issued a report that said Saudi border guards killed nearly 800 Ethiopian migrants and wounded another 1,700 in 2022. Human Rights Watch followed up with a similar report that said the killings could be considered a crime against humanity. After the reports were released, the New York Times reported that the U.S. was aware of the mass killings on the border since 2022, but kept quiet. Around the same time the U.S. learned of the massacre, the Biden administration was publicly criticizing Riyadh for OPEC oil cuts. The MMC new report says that the new evidence appears to indicate that the Saudi border authorities at their southern border with Yemen are continuing to use live weapons to fire indiscriminately at Ethiopians and Yemenis crossing the border irregularly. A ceasefire between Saudi Arabia and Yemen's Houthis has held well since April 2022, but Yemeni media frequently reports Saudi shelling at the border in Yemen's northern Sadat province. Yemeni citizens and African migrants are often reported killed. The news of Saudi's continued killing at the border comes after reports said the U.S. is planning to resume offensive weapon sales to Riyadh. The U.S. is also pushing Saudi-Israeli normalization deal that would involve Washington giving Riyadh a mutual defense guarantee. And so, just so interesting how the Biden administration says, our foreign policy is all about commitment to world order and respecting international norms and these liberal values. And then when it comes to what they actually do with their foreign policy, they give weapons to countries that kill migrants and people displaced from wars that Saudi Arabia has engaged in. All right, everybody, thank you so much for tuning into the show today. I will be back with more later. One more show this week on Friday. And then, of course, we'll be back with a full lineup of shows next week. Also should mention here, coming up, not next week, but the week after, my colleague at antiwar.com, Dave DeCamp, is taking a vacation. He's been saying this on his show, Antiwar.com News with Dave DeCamp. And so for about 2 weeks, I'm going to be writing news stories for antiwar.com, as well as doing the viewpoints and stuff for the Institute. So just as a heads up, not this week, but the week after, I'm not sure what the schedule of the show is going to look like. My guess is I will be putting out a show every day. The timing of the show may be a little bit more questionable than the morning release, usually by 8 a.m. Eastern time that we usually have. So just don't be surprised if not next week, but the week after and the week after that, the show schedule is just a little bit irregular. All right, everybody, thank you all so much for tuning in. Again, back with another show on Friday.